Hello everyone, this is Erik, the Asian movie enthusiast, and this is my review of Blade of the Immortal, which is a Japanese action film directed by Takashi Miike that just came out this past weekend. Now, I did have the opportunity to see it while on vacation near Namba Parks Cinema in Osaka, Japan, so I decided to check it out after buying my Japanese kitchen knife, of course. So, the movie did not have English subtitles, unfortunately, so my impressions over the dialogue may change after I get to see it with subtitles in the future. However, I think that I have a pretty good idea and handle of the plot after seeing the film and reading some online resources and plot synopses. So this movie was loosely based on a long-running manga series, so there's plenty of information out there regarding the characters and general story. Now, Blade of the Immortal takes place in Japan during the mid-Tokugawa Shogunate period, and follows the deeds of Manji, a skilled samurai who has a decisive advantage. No conventional wound can kill him. Now, in the past, his actions of vengeance related to the death of a family member led to the deaths of over 100 samurai. So after that event, and near death himself, he becomes immortal at the hands of an 800-year-old nun named Yaobikuni. So decades later, he befriends a young girl who desperately wants to avenge the death of her parents, who were slayed by a master swordsman who was attempting to take over all of the other dojos. So can Manji fight through the villain's clan of assassins and secure justice for their deplorable actions? Well, you'll find out if you watch Blade of the Immortal. So the previews and trailers for this movie looked a little bit iffy to me, but that's the case with most Japanese movie trailers, because they use, sponsored J-pop and J-rock music that portrays a mood and tone that's utterly inconsistent with the films themselves in many cases. So from the trailer of Blade of the Immortal, I was kind of expecting a fairly light sword-fighting movie with some cheesy acting and some decent action scenes. Also, director Takashi Miike is fresh off his recent 2016 film Terraformers, or is it called Terraformars? I don't know, it's spelled like Terraformars, which was a gigantic pile of rat-infested dog crap, so that's not good. So I went into Blade of the Immortal with some trepidation. So needless to say, I was a bit surprised when confronted with the opening 10 or so minutes of this movie, which are legitimately outstanding. I'm not going to tell you exactly what happens, but even Miike's most vocal critics, and there are a number of them, should admit that that opening sequence of events is pretty fantastic. It's also shot in black and white, by the way. The rest of the film is in color. That whole scene, to me, is basically critic-proof. It's a great scene. And it also establishes a much darker tone than one might expect from the trailers. This movie does get pretty violent and harrowing very early on, and I kind of like that. So we'll get to the acting and the story elements in a few minutes, because Blade of the Immortal is an action film first and foremost, so it really needs to succeed on that front in order to work overall. And most fortunately, I think that this is a very effective action extravaganza. There's a ton of fighting in the movie, which is an obvious positive, but the placement of the action is very nicely spaced throughout the runtime. In my fairly recent review of Call of Heroes, I mentioned that Benny Chan is a very good director at spacing out his action and maximizing the pacing of his action films, and Miike kind of does the same thing here with Blade of the Immortal. There are a few huge battles that are kind of standouts, but there's also a lot of one-on-one duels or scuffles with small handfuls of characters that are peppered throughout. So this movie keeps moving, and there always seems to be a fight lurking around the corner, and I really like that about this film. And consequently, its 140-minute runtime flies by much faster than you might think. But what about the quality of the action itself? I think it's good. You're not going to see like the blistering fast, intricately choreographed fights of something like the Rurouni Kenshin trilogy of recent years. This is more of a traditional swordplay style that you would have seen in films from like the 1970s, which does kind of increase the risk of things getting a little bit monotonous. and there are a few moments that do feel repetitive. For example, our protagonist kills 2 or 3 enemies in a row during the first half of the film, using a somewhat unfair technique, which is actually kind of interesting. And the big battles also have a few repetitive sword strikes, given the number of deaths, because this movie has a huge body count. But with that said, Blade of the Immortal does compensate for this by introducing different weapons and character abilities. So as an example, Arika Toda's character uses a 3-section staff with spades on both ends, which allows for some pretty cool strikes and grappling maneuvers that were quite creative, I thought. The protagonist's ability to heal himself also provides some interesting moments during the fight. So overall, I think this is creative enough and has enough, it mixes things up enough to maintain entertainment value. Now, in terms of the camera work and the editing, most of the action is shot with wider camera angles, which I personally prefer because you can clearly see everything. But there are also a number of close-up shots that are mixed in for to add intensity to these scenes, which I found to be less effective. So I'm not sure what the split of those would be, maybe 70-30 or 65-35 in terms of the percentages of long shots versus close-up shots. But overall, I think it's pretty nicely shot overall. And finally, the lead actor, Takuya Kimura, moves very well with a sword, actually. His physical performance in this is very convincing. That's a big positive. When he's cutting people down, it looks pretty cool. So I give him props. I'm not sure if he worked out or had a workout routine or consulted in terms of how to use a sword, in a very impactful way. You know what I mean? But he did a good job in this. And speaking of the performances, I think they're generally good here. Kimura he carries the movie quite easily. Sota Fukushi handles the villain role fairly well, and Arika Toda steals the show whenever she shows up. I like the lead actress, Hana Sugisaki, too, but she does tend to scream her lines a little bit too much. I kind of wish Miike would have dialed her down a little bit, but it's just one thing I noticed that could have been improved upon. Again, I did not have subtitles while watching this, but story and characters seemed rather basic, and simplistic. There didn't seem to be a whole lot going on there. Not a big problem in my eyes for a full-throttled action flick like this one is, but a few of the side characters did seem to be wasted. You know what I mean? Like, Chiaki Kuriyama shows up in this, but she didn't really do much at all. And I was hoping she would get at least one, good action scene. She didn't really get one. Filmmakers probably wanted to insert more characters from the manga into the film, so a few of them do feel like they were shoehorned in unnecessarily. One thing I did like, though, is how at certain times the villains are placed in the same bad predicaments as the protagonists, which means that they occasionally have the same common enemy. So I kind of like that aspect of it. So overall, I found Blade of the Immortal to be an entertainingly violent action romp. Even though the story and characters seem pretty basic, if you have the opportunity to see this movie and you're in the mood for some, swordplay action, I recommend this. I think this is a good flick from Miike. Certainly an entertaining one. And as always, we will see you next time.